I have written another article for New Eastern Outlook. It is titled U.S. Seizing Panama and Greenland Aimed at China. And this is all based on a recent interview with the new U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. This is on the State Department's official website. Secretary Marco Rubio with Megyn Kelly of The Megyn Kelly Show, January 30th, 2025. And the whole transcript is there for you to read. The link will be in the video description. I'm going to read a bit from this interview, and I'm going to explain to you the true nature of the Trump administration's foreign policy. And you will see that it is indistinguishable from the Biden administration, the first Trump administration, 8 years of Obama, 8 years of Bush, so on and so forth. There is one single foreign policy because there is one single circle of special interest driving U.S. foreign policy. It does not matter who is in the White House. It does not matter who runs Congress. These corporations fund policy think tanks that create policy papers. The papers are transformed by lawyers into bills. The bills go to Washington with lobbyists who get everyone on both sides of the aisle to sign off on them. And then they bring it to the corporate media, which they also control, obviously, and they sell this agenda to the American people, making them think that this is an agenda that somehow benefits them, when it almost always comes at the expense of the American people. Let me read this article. As always, I will add additional information when and if necessary. So, despite the temporary window of false hope, some perceived the recent U.S. presidential election as U.S. foreign policy has once again continued onward toward the pursuit of primacy, global primacy. It's not about America first. It's not about turning inward and investing in the U.S. for the sake of the American people. It is about maintaining America's empire worldwide. For whose benefit? For the benefit of the corporations and financial institutions that built the empire. While a recent interview with the newly confirmed U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio began with promising slogans, it quickly unraveled into threats of overt aggression, including outright calls to seize the Panama Canal and annex Greenland from Denmark under the implicit threat of military force. While the change in presidential administration is purely superficial, and it is, the intense urgency it pursues continuity of agenda with is not. There is this heightened sense of urgency, and it began during the Biden administration, and now it is increasing under this new Trump administration. It reflects the rapid rise of China, I would say irreversible rise of China, Russian resilience in the face of U.S. proxy war in Ukraine, and an expanding multipolar world overriding the US-led unipolar world at ever-increasing speeds. Now, a lot of people believe that multipolarism's rise is a done deal. It is inevitable. I would warn highly against underestimating America's capacity to disrupt and destroy the emerging multipolar world, even if it itself is destroyed in the process. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, in a recent interview with Megyn Kelly, the transcript of which was published on the U.S. State Department's official website, which I just showed you and will be in the video description below, began with a discussion about the end of the unipolar world and U.S. foreign policy moving forward. And this was a very hopeful first step, very uncharacteristic of Marco Rubio as a senator and in his capacity supporting U.S. wars and regime change around the globe. And this is what Secretary Rubio would begin by saying. It's not normal for the world to simply have a unipolar power. That was an anomaly. You have to remember, this is a discussion between two people, so it's not going to flow like a written speech. It was a product of the end of the Cold War, but eventually you were going to reach back to a point where you had a multipolar world, multi-great powers in different parts of the planet. We face that now with China and to some extent Russia, and then you have rogue states like Iran and North Korea you have to deal with. And I guess they're rogue states because they won't roll over and allow the US to invade, subjugate, and plow them under like they have Iraq and even South Korea. Think about South Korea. It has been militarily occupied by the US, politically captured by the US since the end of the Korean War. Think about that. So He continues, so now more than ever, we need to remember that foreign policy should always be about furthering the natural interest of the United States and doing so to the extent possible, avoiding war and armed conflict, which we have seen 2 times in the last century be very costly. So again, seems very reasonable at first. And this is what I say in the article. At face value, this first appears to be a sober, rational, even welcomed approach to U.S. foreign policy. The realization that the pursuit of U.S. primacy is unsustainable, although that's not really what Secretary Rubio said, but that's what you might assume listening to his comments, and that the U.S. must accept a multipolar world. He seems to imply that, but of course, he doesn't. Moreover, it appears to suggest the U.S.'s pursuit of a place within this emerging multipolar world should be done, quote, avoiding war and armed conflict, unquote. The problem, of course, is upon closer inspection of Secretary Rubio's words throughout the rest of the interview, it becomes clear that the avoidance of war is predicated not on compromises the U.S. is willing to make to find a constructive place for itself within this multipolar world, but instead on the compromises the U.S. expects nations like Russia and China to make for the U.S. to avoid any sort of compromise or concession at all. So in other words, the U.S. gets to keep its empire, gets to keep all of the unwarranted influence and control and military occupation it has all around the world. The rest of the world is going to have to work around it. And this is basically what Secretary Rubio ends up saying throughout the rest of the interview. At one point during the interview, Secretary Rubio insists China wants to be the most powerful country in the world, and they want to do so at our expense. And that's not in our national interest. And we're going to address that. We don't want a war over it, but forget everything you heard before the word but. We're going to address it. And of course, we're going to address it through the use of military force or the threat of military force. That is what he's implying there. We don't want a war over it, but we're going to address it. And again, whenever you hear the word but, just forget everything you heard before it. And it is true, China will rise at the expense of the US, but only because the US is unable to justify or maintain its continued and unwarranted influence worldwide, except through the threat of coercion, interference, and outright political or military capture. Just think about U.S. influence over Taiwan. This is an island province of China. It is internationally recognized as Chinese territory, yet the U.S. has politically captured it. It has stationed U.S. military troops on it, illegally, absolutely illegally. And Secretary Rubio would say China's rise, its full reunification of Taiwan with the rest of China under international law would come at the expense of U.S. influence and therefore must be prevented. This is what he would say if you asked him about Taiwan specifically. And he has talked about Taiwan all throughout his career, and he has contributed to the conflict with China over the status of Taiwan, which has been resolved under international law and even bilateral agreements between the US and China. The US is simply violating its own agreements and its own obligations under international law. It's as simple as that. During the interview, Secretary Rubio indicated that the Panama Canal will be among the first targets of US aggression under the Trump administration, outright stating the objective is for the U.S. to once again administer the canal, opened 111 years ago and handed over to Panama in 1999. So almost a quarter of a century ago was handed over to Panama. Now, before I continue reading about Secretary Rubio and all of his complaining about the Panama Canal, which is utterly absurd, even I could go as far as saying childish, you have to remember that this is exactly what people like Secretary Rubio accused China of: building infrastructure in other countries and then using that infrastructure as a means of exerting control over that country, its territory and infrastructure indefinitely. That is what the US is actually doing in practice. This is what it accused China of theoretically at some point in the future, not something that China has actually ever done. Secretary Rubio, echoing recent claims made by President Trump, said, a few years ago, Panama made the decision that they were going to de-recognize Taiwan and align with Beijing. And I will explain that in just a moment. And with that came all sorts of money that was provided to the then president's administration for projects and things of that nature, but also Chinese investment. And one of these main investments they have is in these two port facilities on the entry on both sides of the canal, and all kinds of other infrastructure, cranes and the like, things that Panama actually needs for its economy to continue growing and to facilitate trade, including for China. Now, let me show you where these ports are so that you can understand just how ridiculously you're being lied to by the Trump administration and Secretary Rubio. Let's go to Google Earth. This is the United States, and 1,000 miles to the south is the Panama Canal. 1,000 miles to the south is the Panama Canal. Now, here is the northern entrance to the canal. You can see the canal is here, and they have the gates that ships have to go through. These are actually the entrances. Here is the port. Here is one of the ports. A Chinese company based in Hong Kong operates right here. You do not pass through it to get to the canal. You're passing by it. You can pass very far away from it to approach and pass through the canal. Now the ships go through the waterway, through the canal, and they exit through the southern entrance exit here. And again, here are the locks. And here's the other port they're talking about, Port of Balboa. There's also a cruise terminal here. Again, the ships passing through the canal go past the Port of Balboa and this terminal. They do not go through it. So I have not heard any explanation from Secretary Rubio or President Trump or anyone else repeating this absurd, fabricated lie about China somehow threatening passage through the Panama Canal. I've not even heard a single, even hypothetical explanation as to how China would stop the flow of traffic through the Panama Canal. Not to mention, the only other nation in human history to seize control of the Panama Canal was the US itself. And I'll get into that here in just a moment. Secretary Rubio is talking about these port facilities. I just showed you where they are. You see that they do not actually control the entrance and exits of the canal. This is what he then concludes based on that lie that he's telling you. This is the next lie he tells you. If China wanted to obstruct traffic in the Panama Canal, they could. That's a fact. No, it's not a fact. And he never explains how they actually could. And it's my view that's a violation of the treaty agreement. And that's what President Trump is raising. And we're going to address that topic. Now, the treaty has something to do with maintaining the neutrality of the canal. What Secretary Rubio and what President Trump and others are saying is that China could potentially jeopardize the neutrality of the canal. Not that they actually have, so how is that a violation of the treaty? It is some sort of hypothetical, far-fetched violation. Sometime in the distant future, the US is going to use that as a pretext to seize control of the Panama Canal from Panama, where it's actually located, again, 1,000 miles away from US borders. It should be pointed out that Panama's decision, so this goes back to Secretary Rubio complaining about Panama de-recognizing Taiwan. It should be pointed out that Panama's decision to de-recognize Taiwan and align with Beijing reflects what Washington itself recognizes as the one China policy. So in other words, Panama simply aligned its policy on the status of Taiwan with the United States. The US has a one China policy. It does not recognize Taiwan. It recognizes China, the People's Republic of China, and a one China policy. Is the only way China, the actual real nation of China, the People's Republic of China, will do business with another country. If the US said Taiwan is independent, it is a free, independent country, China would immediately stop doing business with the US. And it could precipitate war because under international law, Taiwan is part of China, period. And just to prove this to you, I will go to Secretary Marco Rubio's US Department of State official website, US relations with Taiwan, US-Taiwan relationship. And if you come down here, you will see very explicitly, we do not support Taiwan independence. the United States has a long-standing one China policy, and all Panama did was adopt a one China policy. They went from recognizing Taiwan to recognizing Beijing and its sovereignty over Taiwan, just as the US officially does, although unofficially it undermines it at every possible opportunity it gets. And again, that is what is at the crux of growing tension with China, not China and any sort of perceived aggression China is pursuing. So it should be pointed out that Panama's decision to de-recognize Taiwan and align with Beijing reflects what Washington itself recognizes as the one China policy, in which nations and the UN, international law, recognize there is one China, Taiwan is part of China, and there is only one legitimate government of China, the People's Republic of China in Beijing. Panama had only recognized the Republic of China in Taipei under US pressure, and there's a tiny handful of nations left that recognize Taiwan, and that is only because the US pressures them to do so, even though the US itself officially does not. So try to keep track of the hypocrisy and the lies upon lies being used to prop up and propel US foreign policy. Its decision to adopt a one China policy in line with international law indicates weakening US influence over Panama and offers another clue as to why the US seeks to reassert control over the Central American nation. Again, it's not really about any sort of real threat China poses. China poses no real threat, not to the Panama Canal, not to the United States, not to trade. It's mostly Chinese trade anyway. And even the Panama Canal on the other side of the planet, China is the second largest user of the canal after the United States itself. The real problem here is the United States and its need to control other nations and undermine their sovereignty, undermine independent foreign policy and political independence, again, in contravention of international law. No details were given as to how Chinese-based companies operating ports at either end of the canal could, in fact, obstruct traffic in the Panama Canal itself, or how the US government's administration of the canal would affect the port facilities which are separate from the actual canal. So even if the US seized control of the Panama Canal and all of the facilities associated with it, these ports are separate from the canal. So would the US seize control of Chinese owned and operated ports? And wouldn't that be an act of war? What if another nation did that to the United States, if the US actually owned real infrastructure anywhere in the world? Secretary Rubio would dive even deeper into the topic. Now, you have to pay very close attention to this, and this does amount to a grown man who is now Secretary of State of the US crying about how unfair it is that Panama, with infrastructure it has within its borders, 1,000 miles away from the US, is deciding how to administer the canal and how unfair it is to the United States. Hong Kong, this is a quote from Secretary Rubio, Hong Kong-based companies having control over the entry and exit points of the canal. So this is blatantly untrue. You saw the map. These are not the entrance and exit points of the canal. These are ports that you pass toward the entrance and exit, is completely unacceptable. That cannot continue because the US says so. No, because of, and if there's a conflict and China tells them, do everything you can to obstruct the canal so that the US can't engage in trade and commerce, so that the US military and naval fleet cannot get to the Indo-Pacific fast enough, they would have to do it. So this is hypothetical. There's no proven threat. This is just something Secretary Rubio is imagining in his mind, fabricating in his imagination. They would have to do it, and they would do it. And now we'd have a major problem on our hands. That's number one. Number two, we have to talk about the fact that we built this thing. We paid for it. Thousands of people died doing this 111 years ago. Just keep that in mind. And somehow our naval vessels who go through there and American shipping that goes through there pays rates, some cases higher than other countries are paying. For example, a vessel from China. Again, I haven't seen any evidence of this. As a matter of fact, even the Western media itself is reporting that this is not true, that the only reason the US pays more is because they use the canal more. That's also not acceptable. It was a terrible deal when it was made. It should never have been allowed. They're going to tell you that it's set by an independent administrative entity and not the government. That's their internal problem. They'll have to figure that out. But we should not be in a position of having to pay more than other countries. In fact, we should be getting a discount or maybe for free because we paid for the thing. So again, this is the United States, Secretary Rubio, shamelessly doing what he always accuses China is going to eventually do with all of its Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure around the globe. Cite their building of the infrastructure as some sort of perpetual control they now exercise over these countries they built the infrastructure in. Let's continue. The problem for Secretary Rubio and the special interests he serves, and I'm not talking about President Trump and his administration, is that indeed a deal, however Secretary Rubio feels about it, was made. It was made. That deal was made. The U.S. made that deal. Whether you like it or not, that is the deal that was made. The treaty signed regarding the Panama Canal and Panama's sovereignty over it cannot simply be reversed suddenly because the U.S. no longer finds them favorable. The U.S. did indeed build the canal, but it chose to build it over 1,000 miles from its own borders on territory of another nation 111 years ago. That nation rightfully assumed control over the canal a quarter of a century ago and has the right to administer the canal in any way it wants, even if Washington perceives it as unfair or otherwise detrimental to its interests. Just because something serves America's interests doesn't automatically entitle the U.S. to it. And that applies to Greenland. We'll get to Greenland here in just a moment. Just because Greenland has lots of resources the U.S. would like to get its hands on, it's strategically located, it would help the U.S. further encircle and contain Russia and China, doesn't entitle the U.S. to Greenland. It doesn't. But what it does do, this mentality of the United States, the fact the U.S. is talking openly like this to the rest of the world, indicates that it's not Russia and China that actually pose the biggest threat to peace, stability, and prosperity for the entire planet. It is the U.S. and this mindset that it can do whatever it wants, regardless of international law, regardless of national sovereignty, beyond American borders. There is no sovereignty in the eyes of the U.S. beyond their borders. It is all for the U.S. to do with what it pleases. So it is the threat in reality it always warns the world that China will somehow become. China's ability to invest in ports, bridges, and other infrastructure at either end of the canal is owed to America's own disinterest in doing so. These ports, bridges, and other infrastructure projects just as easily could have been American investments if that was how the U.S. still interacted with other nations. They built the canal. How come they don't continue building projects all around the world? Why don't they build ports and bridges in places like Panama? How come only China is doing it? And is that China's fault or is that America's fault? Instead, the U.S. interacts in an entirely different manner through coercion, interference, political capture, and outright military invasion. The U.S. has already once invaded Panama and seized the canal over the course of December 1989 and January 1990, just 9 years before the canal was fully handed over to Panama. Likewise, on grounds that the canal's neutrality was being violated. So this isn't the first time the U.S. has used this trick. And this took place under the administration of Bush Sr. And so as you can see, continuity of agenda. This has nothing to do with the Trump administration. These are the unelected special interests that determined U.S. foreign policy back during the Bush Sr. administration, the Bush Jr. administration, Obama, Trump, Biden, and now Trump again. Secretary Rubio's declared intent to once again violate Washington's own treaty with Panama and trample the nation's security, sovereignty, and territorial integrity is as much a threat to global peace and stability in reality as Secretary Rubio baselessly, and I would say incessantly, accuses China of in fiction. This represents a microcosm of exactly how the U.S. seeks to prevent China from rising at America's expense, or more accurately, at the expense of America's unwarranted primacy beyond its borders. In other words, yes, China is going to rise, and it will come at the expense of American power and influence. and its military basing all around the globe, primarily because it has no business being all over the globe in the first place. It invited itself into these places through coercion, through political capture, through military conquest, and it was able to do that because there was no one else to stop them. Now, with the rise of China, with the reemergence of Russia, with a growing multipolar world, there are checks and balances to American power, and it will roll back American power, but it should never have expanded to this extent in the first place. It was never warranted in the first place. It is, again, exactly what the US is always accusing Russia and China of, but it is the US actually demonstrably and perpetually doing it all throughout the 19th, 20th, and 21st century. Greenland was another target of US aggression mentioned by Secretary Rubio. So again, the Trump administration promised it was going to end all of President Biden's wars overseas, interventions overseas. They claimed that they were going to pause or freeze foreign aid, but in reality, now that they're in office, Secretary Rubio is laying out step by step how they are going to continue and actually expand American aggression around the globe, including against nations other than Russia and China, Denmark and Panama. So this is what Secretary Rubio said about Greenland. The Arctic Circle and the Arctic region is going to become critical for shipping lanes, for how you get some of this energy that's going to be produced under President Trump. These energies rely on shipping lanes. The Arctic has some of the most valuable shipping lanes in the world. As some of the ice is melting, it's becoming more and more navigable. We need to be able to defend that. So Greenland is in a perfect position to take advantage of these shipping lanes, and we want to take advantage of the shipping lane, so we're entitled to take Greenland from Denmark. This is basically what Secretary Rubio is saying. And then he works in the false pretext. So this is what he says. So if you project what the Chinese have done, it's just a matter of time before, because they are not an Arctic power, they do not have an Arctic presence, so they need to be able to have somewhere that they can stage from, probably alongside their allies in Russia, I would say. So this just further exposes how false this pretext Secretary Rubio is presenting to the public. And it is completely realistic to believe that the Chinese will eventually, maybe even the short term, try to do in Greenland what they have done at the Panama Canal and in other places. And that is install facilities that give them access to the Arctic with the cover of a Chinese company, but that in reality serve a dual purpose. That is, in a moment of conflict, they could send naval vessels to that facility and operate from there. And that is completely unacceptable to the national security of the world and to the security of the world and the national security of the United States. So again, a hypothetical scenario, disconnected from reality, sometime in the distant future. This is what entitles the US to seize territory from a sovereign nation, a nation in Europe, Denmark. Again, Secretary Rubio is talking about seizing control of another nation's territory because of the hypothetical threats he claims China could pose in the future, but also because of Greenland's value to US interests, because the US itself has already agreed with Denmark to aid in the defense of Greenland. Secretary Rubio concludes, and again, this is a direct quote, "If we're already on the hook for having to do that, then why? We might as well have more control over what happens there." Again, as if Denmark forced the United States to agree to defend Greenland, help Denmark defend Greenland. You have to remember that NATO and the European Union itself was imposed upon Europe by the US and the special corporate financier interests that drive US foreign policies. This was not something Europeans were clamoring for and wanted. It is something that was imposed upon them by US special interests. It is something that Europeans chafe under to this day, and only a handful of client regimes installed into power and kept there by US special interests continue this whole project. This whole arrangement between the US and Denmark over Greenland was something the US wanted, not something that Denmark wanted. And what Secretary Rubio is basically saying, well, we basically control Europe. I mean, this is what he's really saying behind this smokescreen. We already control Europe. We might as well just do it openly and more directly. That this is what he's really saying. None of Secretary Rubio's explanations over either the Panama Canal or Greenland is backed by international law. In fact, America's intent toward both stands in direct contravention of international law. When asked about President Trump's refusal to rule out military force in annexing Greenland, Secretary Rubio admitted this was meant to keep leverage on the table, implying the U.S. would use everything up to and including the threat of military force to acquire Greenland if Denmark refused. So in other words, at first when he heard the interviewer ask about the threat of military force, he kind of tried to deny it. And then when it was explained to him that it was just the threat of military force not being taken off the table, he said, well, we're not threatening military force, but we're not taking it off the table. Well, then you're essentially, you're threatening military force. You're saying, we're going to offer you a deal, but we're not going to accept no for an answer, and we have military force on the table if necessary. This is what the U.S. is openly doing to their allies. So in summation, annexation over persuasion. The U.S. does not have a better deal to offer the world. It does not have a better vision for the world's future than the emerging multipolar world. So what it's left to do is simply grab by force whatever it can of the world before the world pivots toward multipolarism. That's what this is about. Since the end of the Cold War, the U.S. has had no obligation to offer anything to nations it exercises control over, owed to a lack of alternatives. In Panama, for example, if a government obstructed U.S. interests, even within Panama's own borders, the U.S. could simply remove the government from power. If a government resisted regime change, the U.S. would, and in fact has, militarily invaded, overthrown the government in power, and replaced it with an obedient client regime. With the rise of China and China's eagerness to offer nations around the world constructive alternatives to Washington's one-way relationships, nations like Panama now have options. Unlike China, the U.S. is unable to offer port modernization, bridges, and other infrastructure projects. The U.S. is failing to invest even back at home. The U.S. is not even investing in any of this back at home. In the absence of America's ability to provide a more compelling offer than China to nations around the globe, the U.S. is simply and openly seeking to annex key territory and infrastructure rather than have the nations this territory and infrastructure actually belongs to pivot toward a closer relationship with China. Ordinarily, the U.S. would use political capture of Panama, regime change, to remove the government and install a client regime that would uproot these Chinese-operated ports from Panama, from around the Panama Canal, and would invite the U.S. military back in. But for some reason, they're not able to, or they don't have time to. So they are resorting to a much more drastic and extreme measure to achieve this. Or maybe they're using this to begin the process of implementing regime change in Panama. Either way, this is owed to America's inability to offer Panama a real alternative. All they can use is coercion and force. Despite repeatedly claiming China poses a grave threat to U.S. interests, with many assuming this means an actual national security threat to the U.S., in reality, China only poses a threat to America's ability to exercise unwarranted primacy over other nations abroad. So again, the U.S., after the Cold War, was able to do whatever it wanted around the globe. There was no limit to what it was able to do except its own military power, its ability to project military power abroad. But as China rose and Russia reemerged, nations like Iran continued to survive attempts by the U.S. to overthrow their government and install client regimes. The setbacks the U.S. faced in places like Iraq, or Libya, or Afghanistan, or even Syria, even though they ultimately succeeded, that was way behind schedule. There is now sufficient global power besides the US that is able to begin checking and balancing American impunity. The other alternative would be for the US to accept a rational and constructive, and I would say proportional, place among the nations of an emerging multipolar world. Even Secretary Rubio admits is taking shape, forfeiting primacy over all other nations. Unfortunately, Secretary Rubio and the special interests he represents still deeply believe in their own sense of superiority and the impunity they believe that entitles them to. Secretary Rubio can deny U.S. foreign policy seeks out war, but he has clearly laid out a course of action that depends on other nations subordinating their sovereignty under international law to U.S. interests in order to actually avoid that war. So Secretary Rubio says, we don't want war. We want to avoid war. We want to make sure China doesn't rise at our expense, but we don't want war. But we're going to do all of these horrible, unwarranted, frankly, illegal things around the globe to provoke war. And if we are to avoid war, the answer is very simple. These nations should just accept that we're doing this. That is what they mean when they say they want to avoid war. We could avoid war. All China has to do is subordinate itself to us. That's all. We don't want war in the Indo-Pacific region. All China has to do is submit to us. All Iran has to do in the Middle East is leave power and allow us to pick their next government, and there will be no war. That's what they actually mean when they say they want to avoid war. They clearly aren't trying to avoid war. They're simply putting the impetus to avoid war on the targets of their aggression. So this is just another 4 years of continued pursuit of U.S. hegemony, simply under the MAGA America First brand. However, nothing Secretary Rubio discussed in this interview has anything to do with improving the lives and the prospects of the American people. As a matter of fact, it's only going to make things worse. You continuously confront China, you impede Chinese trade around the globe. You're obviously preparing for a global blockade against Chinese shipping. All of that is going to compound the cost of living crisis Americans are already suffering under because of U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. is not trying to reshore industry. If you really wanted to reshore industry in the United States, you would have to reform education, which no one is even pretending to want to do. And you would also have to completely re-examine industry in the United States itself, infrastructure in the United States itself. None of these things are being looked at because that is not the goal. This is not about reindustrializing the US. This is about stopping China before it surpasses the US and preserving this artificial monopoly US special interests have enjoyed for decades following the Cold War. I also want to add that during this interview with Secretary Rubio, he talked about the freezing of foreign aid. Now, a lot of people were interpreting this more or less in the way they wanted to believe it was meant. But in reality, Secretary Rubio explained it very clearly. They're just sorting through it. And when they can confirm that this continues advancing U.S. interests abroad, which includes political interference abroad, regime change abroad, coercion abroad, they will continue the funding. So this is what it says right here. And again, the link will be in the video description below. Let me read through it. He says, I think what's important is to talk about the purpose of this pause. So they're not freezing it, they're not stopping it, they're only pausing it. If I went to these foreign $60 billion a year, if I went to these and said, okay, show me your foreign aid programs and what they do, historically, we've gotten very little cooperation. But if you go to them and say, okay, your money is stopped until you tell us what you do, now you get a lot more cooperation. Continue. So now a process exists, and that process is you apply for a waiver, and everybody knows how to apply for a waiver. They know how to come forward and say, this is what our program does, and this is why it's important. This is why it makes America safer, stronger, or more prosperous. This is why it's in our national interest. And all of this, all of these excuses, these reasons are the exact same reasons Secretary Rubio, when he was on the board of directors of the National Endowment for Democracy's International Republican Institute. These were all the excuses they used for foreign interference abroad. So none of this indicates any sort of stop or freeze or reversal of U.S. interference abroad. It simply means Secretary Rubio and the Trump administration want to make sure every single penny is going toward regime change and empire building overseas. He has said nothing at all about stopping that aspect of U.S. foreign assistance. All in air quotes. Now we'll get details about these programs, and we may say, okay, the program gets a waiver, or we may say, well, the program gets a partial waiver. You do 5 things, 3 of them are critical, 2 of them remain under pause. That's what it gives us the opportunity to do now, thinking of it almost as an audit, but not an audit in which we're voluntarily asking for cooperation. I think we're now getting a lot more cooperation, because otherwise you don't get your money. Then it goes down here and it says, and so I think as the weeks go on, you will see more and more programs come back online. So they're going to give them all of the funding. They're just making sure that none of it is being wasted or pilfered by others. They want to make sure they're the ones pilfering American taxpayer dollars and using it abroad instead of investing it in America where it belongs. Some will be partial, some will be full, but we've got to get control of this. We have this thing that I've called the foreign aid industrial complex, all of these entities around the world that are getting millions and millions of dollars from the United States. We have to make sure that it's aligned with our national interests. So he's not talking about stopping it. He just wants to make sure that it is producing the results he and the interests he works for want. And that's what we are prioritizing. That's what we're spending it on, things that really matter and are really producing. So is this the end of U.S. regime change abroad? No. I would say it's greater focus on U.S. regime change abroad, cutting out anything that could actually be perceived as aid and focusing entirely on regime change. Again, this is exactly where Secretary Rubio, when he was Senator Marco Rubio, this is where he was. This is the job he had to leave to become Secretary of State. This is November 2024. I congratulate board member Senator Marco Rubio. This is the International Republican Institute. This is one of the organizations funding regime change all across Europe, all across Central Asia, here in Southeast Asia, all across Latin America, all across Africa. All of these regime change operations we saw under the Biden administration. So when he was Senator Rubio, he was directly involved in this sedition, U.S. government-funded sedition. So no, he's not stopping it. The Trump administration is not stopping it. They're not even pretending that they're stopping it. They just hope that you see what you want to see and you don't hold them accountable for what they're actually doing. So we'll have to keep a very close eye on this. I hope that people who generously extended the benefit of the doubt to the Trump administration, I hope they listen to Secretary Rubio's words and blatant threats against sovereign nations to strip away their territory and their infrastructure. I hope they're listening to this, and what they hear is a continuation of U.S. aggression, militarization, and pursuit of empire abroad, because that is exactly what it is. There is no other way to interpret it, no matter what branding is applied. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check out the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. All of my videos are posted on YouTube, Rumble, X, and Telegram. In the video description below are the links to the article I read from, as well as to the articles that I cited in that article. There are also ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. They're not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and through Patreon. Again, the links will be in the video description below. For everyone who is already supporting my work, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or even if you have no resources to spare and you're just helping share my work with others, getting the word out there, all of that is greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.